Welcome everybody to the Captain Spot. I am your host, Justin Freeman, 6 foot 1 inches, 286 pounds of fantasy knowledge. That's right, the heavy Chevy, getting a little bit lighter. Got a little weight loss plan. That's the reason I'm telling you guys my weight at the front end of every episode. I really trying to drop a few lbs. I had lost quite a few pounds until the quarantine hit, and just all hell has broken loose. And so we're trying to get back on that, trying to be accountable to you guys. I'm going to just spit that out every time, just for me. I appreciate you putting up with that. We had a great first episode yesterday with Brian Juster. We've got Mike Leone on the show today from Establish the Run. Really appreciate Mike hopping on. We're going to have a great conversation about simulation and game theory when it comes to DFS Showdown, especially large field. Leone's got a lot of experience, just like Brian Juster for that matter, 150 maxing some of these large prize pool tournaments over on DraftKings. So we'll talk a little bit about that and correlation. Correlation is going to be a huge thing for us over on these Showdown slates. So many thanks to Mike for hopping on, and without further ado, let's hop into that interview. All right, everybody, as promised, we are joined by the one and only Mr. Michael Leone. You know him on Twitter as Two Hats, One Mike. He's got 0 hats for us today. Mike, welcome. How's it going?
It's a hatless day, but it's going pretty well, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, for sure. We obviously know you from a number of different endeavors. Most recently, I mean, you've got the brand loyalty going on here in the background. You're at Establish the Run now. So walk us through. You've had a pretty illustrious DFS career, and you got some new digs.
Yeah, I've got the background here, which makes me look organized, but really my office is a complete disaster right now. So yeah. I've got this makeup on it, so to speak. But yeah, the last couple months I've been working as the director of analytics for Establish the Run, which, you know, it's a dream job. I was super pumped to get it, to be able to work with really, really sharp people like Adam Leviton, Andrew Wiggins, Evan Silva, Taylor Cabey, the co-founders there. So I'm really enjoying that. It's allowed me to take more of a hands-on approach with the data and focus more on that side of things. And I'm still contributing to content here and there, but when I do, it's more macro, well thought out pieces that I think, you know, change the way we play the game and strategize it a little bit differently, getting away from doing that content that, you know, has a shorter shelf life. That's just sort of plays type of stuff.
Well, let me introduce you to a new podcast that's going to be dedicated to single game slates. So it gets no shorter than posting that action and seeing it go bye-bye in 24 hours. So yeah, I can totally empathize with you there. You want that stuff to live on a little bit. Now, you've had a little bit of a pretty lengthy backstory in the grand scheme of things for DFS. Like you've been on these streets for a long, long time. Walk us through kind of how you got to what you're doing now at ETR.
Yeah, it's crazy, you know, going all the way back and thinking how this materialized, like how I got to where I am. And really it started, I wrote in college for a season-long fantasy baseball website called Fantistics, run by Anthony Perry, great guy. And Drew Dinkmeyer wrote for that site as well. And I knew he knew a lot about basketball, and I was playing Draft Street, you know, one of the original DFS sites, basketball. And I was getting my butt kicked. I didn't really know too much then. And, you know, just on a whim, I G-chatted Drew since we wrote for the same site. And, you know, one thing led to another. He helped me out. Then I started making some spreadsheets for him and really just grew from there. And we started our own, I think we were the very first premium DFS advice site on the market. You know, Roto Grinders was there way before us, but they weren't charging for advice yet. And we were the first ones with My Fantasy Fix as an extension of Fantistics. And from there, you know, we got a deal to go over to Roto Experts and do content, which turned into Daily Roto. And now I'm at Establish the Run. So that's how it got started. And, you know, how I've enjoyed the game, how I've consumed the game has really evolved a ton over the years. And one of the things I've always tried to get better at is more like the projection side of things. Again, I was making these very first spreadsheets Drew and I made, it was like copying AccuScore box scores by hand into spreadsheets. It was so archaic. And, you know, as just the market got sharper, I felt the need to get sharper and, you know, just tried to grow my skills in that area in particular.
The vast majority of the hard drive on my computer is just old PFR box scores, like loads and loads of Excel documents just weighing this thing down. So I know what you mean on that. What's funny is, like, for the people who've been playing DFS as long as you have, it seems like you guys just were running into each other a lot there at the start, but maybe that's just the good timing being out ahead of this. Obviously you had a chance to kind of solidify your role in this market and get sort of that first mover edge through a lot of this. So running into a guy like Dink seems like coincidence, but no, you guys were both, grinding this stuff pretty hard, relative to, what the average Joe was doing back then. So it's great to see when things like that sort of pay off. And, obviously what we're here today to discuss is Showdown Slate. So we're going to kind of get into that a little bit. And I know you have a pretty, unique strategy for, how you're handling, creating Showdown lineups. And it's kind of an interesting thing. I know you do a lot of simulations. And so, when I was doing my research here this offseason on Showdown, I'm going through results and I see the top of the leaderboard, Leone M. And I saw you up there like a handful of times, man. Who's this Leone M guy? And like, what's it like to be sweating top prizes at some of the top of these, large field GPPs?
It's wild in Showdown because you can be sitting pretty, feeling pretty good. And then some scrub catches a 10-yard catch and you think it doesn't mean anything. And all of a sudden, you've dropped from first to 200th. And if you're mass multi-entering, which I usually do in Showdown, that's going from winning a whole bunch of money to basically losing money on a slate. So
yeah, it's not just the big touchdowns that are swinging things. It's like every single play is having a direct outcome. Right.
Yeah, it's hard to even sweat Showdown until at least the second half. And even then, sometimes if a certain captain that's low and goes off, you pretty much can filter your lineups to a subset that you're cheering for. But yeah, things can change really, really quickly. I mean, we saw in the Super Bowl, Damian Williams breaks that run at the very end, and he goes from, being in the optimal lineup to being, now he has to be your captain. And Colin Drew, who's at Daily Roto, I've worked with him on Showdown stuff a lot. He's a really sharp guy, also at the top of leaderboards. I know it was really painful for him. I think he lost a good chunk of money on the Mahomes kneel downs. So we're talking about little things moving stuff. Showdown is not a game for the faint of heart. I mean, DFS in general isn't, with the top heavy prize structures now in a lot of these tournaments, but Showdown is like that to the max.
Yeah, for sure. And now you're a multi-sport player. So, I mean, finding the time to dig in really deep has got to be pretty difficult, especially right now. Like, you have the unusual task of sweating the end of NBA season at the same time as NFL prep is going on. So what's like a week in the life of Mike Leone, like, as far as, preparing content, doing your projections and building lineups and whatever else it is you're doing?
Yeah, a lot of seasonality, right? Like a month ago, things were pretty nice. I was, could take my time working on season-long football stuff, pretty stress-free. And, the past 2 weeks have been a bit of a whirlwind with NBA starting back up. I play WNBA DFS just on my own. Don't do anything with that with ETR. But, still keeping the ETR season-long rankings and stuff up to date and running, and pretty soon delving into kind of transforming what we've done with our season-long rankings to DFS to get ready for the season.
Is Levitan still grinding WNBA as well?
I don't think he is too much. Drew does. Levitan, maybe once in a while, but not as much as he used to.
Yeah, I used to talk about that all the time, but that's cool. Well, all right, let's get into meat and potatoes. Let's talk Showdown, NFL, DFS. Obviously, you play Showdown for almost any sport now. It's pretty ubiquitous as far as that goes, but, I'm seeing you having a different approach than the average Joe. I remember we had a conversation on Twitter last season. We were talking about kind of a controversial lineup. It was a Texans lineup, and you made the comment that I just run my sims and hit enter. I'm a robot. That's a direct Michael Leone quote. So, and building a better sim model is something I'm working on right now as well. I've had sims in the past that were just sort of player specific, more range of outcomes type things for players, but actually simulating an entire game kind of makes things really, really interesting. And you get that correlation, which is everything in Showdown, and understanding, how, a rushing touchdown impacts the pass catchers for the same team, or it impacts the pass catchers for the other team. And there's so many different ways that correlation appears. So simulation's got to be a great tactic to get ahead on that. So walk us through, like, what simulation means to you. What does that look like? How are you using that?
Yeah, so I'm not quite at the level of doing a full game simulation yet. That's where I want to get to, because as you said, like that's the ultimate. If you could accurately simulate a game, that's perfect, because you're naturally taking in the correlation. You don't have to do anything tricky. And, the score effects, if you're doing it the right way, that's where I would love to get to. What I'm doing now is kind of like you mentioned, a range of outcomes for the players. And if, however you project ceiling for players, people do it in different ways. There's lots of different ways to project ceiling, but if you just have some idea of the point distribution a player is going to have, you can, from there do Monte Carlo simulations and just pick a random fantasy point total for that player within that set of that distribution that you've, set by however you've done your range of outcomes, ceiling projections, floor projections, whatever you want to call it. The thing I tried to do was, after doing that, let's say you ran, 1,000 projections for each player, just randomly picking these, is, reorder those projections in a way that takes into account the correlation. So it's not perfect from a game simulation standpoint, but you get some of that correlation. I know Fantasy Labs has a correlation matrix, and what's cool with the Fantasy Labs correlation matrix is you can filter them based on certain Vegas totals, and you can also look at team specific ones over different time frames. So just mixing and matching that, I could sort of see, okay, Mahomes and his tight end one and Kelsey have this kind of correlation, and the quarterback and the opposite quarterback in games with totals over 50 have this correlation. So there's a lot of finessing when it comes to that aspect of it, but just trying to, in a way, take these ranges of player outcomes and order them in a way that reflects that correlation. And once you do that, you can start getting a good idea of what a good lineup looks like.
Yeah, and just to clarify for everybody, when we're talking about full game sims, which is sort of the crown jewel, this could actually
yes.
this would be the true moneymaker. We're talking about, essentially, imagine in your mind you're running a Madden simulation with all the proper information logged into that, and you're able to just hit play on the Madden game 10,000 times, record the box scores, and know how many times somebody would be the optimal captain in that lineup, and exactly how to pair each of those players in that lineup. Now, a Monte Carlo simulation is going to be a bit different. Like Mike said, we're taking a range of outcomes for each player and trying to pick different ones within that range. In other words, there's going to be a curve of distributions for Patrick Mahomes, and there's going to be another one for Tyreek Hill. And we know that when Tyreek Hill is very far outlier, in a positive direction, that's likely going to mean the very same thing is true for Patrick Mahomes. So we have a little bit of guesswork figured out for us to help us with that correlation. So having a good correlation matrix like that obviously helps a lot. Now, how much user modification goes into your sims? Obviously, a simulation is only as good as the information that's being fed into it. So, with every week, if Clyde Edwards-Helaire sprains his ankle and it's next man up, and we're talking Darwin Thompson or whoever else is getting the next, that's a tough thing to model in. Mm-hmm. That probably requires some manual adjustment. So walk me through your adjustments and the assumptions that go into your simulation.
Yeah. So I think you need to have sort of a manual on the volume standpoint of things. You really need an active hand. That's the most active hand, where it's not just fully automated, is you need to, like you said, CEH goes down. Okay. Now we're giving Darwin Thompson, 10% of the team's targets or something like that. So, and then from there you can, there's different ways to look at the range of outcomes. You can look at the variability of different stat categories and be like, okay, targets has this standard deviation or whatever. Or, I know like RotoViz, for example, they have their player comparison, and you can look at that and it gives you a high, medium, low. So there's different ways you can do it from there. But to start, the biggest manual adjustment I'm making each week, even when there's not an injury, is I really try to get the volume where I think it's going to be. And then from there, I kind of let the machine do its work, for lack of a better word.
And a pretty normal large number for the machine is like around 10,000. Is that how many simulations you're running, or is it more or less?
Yeah, it depends on the slate or how much time I have. Sometimes there's late news with inactives, and Showdown NFL, those inactives that a lot of weeks seem somewhat innocuous can end up being really important, because those back end wide receivers, for example, a guy that's going to be able to play, be on the field, it might be viable if he's $200 and, all the expensive players hit. So, sometimes I'll reduce it just to be able to get lineups in on time. And then after, I run the sims and kind of look at the optimal lineups, I'll do some filtering based on game theory. I try not to do too much, but the easiest one is to just not run max salary. And depending on how efficiently this slate is priced, I'll change what max salary I'll use. I kind of try to eliminate, if I feel like there's, I don't know, just kind of making up these numbers, but if I feel like there's 1,000 viable lineups, I might want to eliminate, the 250 most expensive of those, and wherever that lies. Sometimes I'll put you at max salary 49.8. Sometimes it'll be, 49.4, just depending on the ways. There's better ways to do that if you really had good ownership projections, where you can kind of figure out, what are the chances someone plays this lineup? And it's a bit more sophisticated way of doing it. But for speed, I usually feel pretty good about just chopping off those most expensive teams that seem to repeat a lot, because in Showdown, you really don't want to be duped. It's super top heavy. I had a slate where, Cooper Kupp, I was sweating this lineup. It was a Rams slate. Cooper Kupp makes a catch at the end. I get in the optimal lineup, I'm pumped, and I see that I'm chopping with like 250 people. And after my 150 entries, I made barely anything. I don't even know if I made money, which is nuts. So it's really important to be unique in Showdown.
Yeah, for sure. So once your sim is done running, how do you actually convert that into lineups, or is your programming spitting out a lineup for each simulation, an optimized lineup for each simulation?
That's what it is. Look at the optimal lineup so you've got, these 10,000 player projections, and, you've sorted them however you want. Then you just cycle through each one 10,000 times, find the optimal lineup. And when you do that, you can see which lineups repeat the most, and that's where the correlation comes into play. And that lineup, I believe you mentioned, that was like a 5-man KC lineup with one Houston guy that seemed a little bit weird. I found that people don't play 5-1 stacks enough, and there's a lot of leverage with those. And this goes to one of the biggest things I realized doing Showdown is people tend to focus too much on what a player needs to occur to hit their like 99th percentile outcome, their absolute ceiling. When in a single, on a full slate, maybe that makes sense where, to win the Millie Maker, you need 8 guys that hit their 90th percentile outcomes, right? But on a single game slate, one game, sometimes there's 0 players even hit that benchmark. So I think people are too worried about that. So there might be a weird situation. And 2 of the Showdowns I did well, and that lineup had Travis Kelce and Blake Bell. Obviously, if Blake Bell is going to hit his ceiling, his true ceiling, Travis Kelce is going to get hurt and not be in the lineup, right? So people won't play that. But what I found is if you're looking more like 75th percentile outcomes for guys, when the offense rolls, everybody rolls a little bit. So you'd be surprised at the positive correlation there. And another slate, and it was a lot of luck, but these slates involve variance. I had Jalen Samuels and James Conner in the same lineup. I had that pairing way more than the field did, because the field, filters out RB1 and RB2. And I found, there are some situations, Minnesota, another one with Dalvin Cook and Alexander Madison, when they're rolling and they're winning by a lot, they're running the ball so much that Madison needs to spell Cook some, so he's getting more carries than usual, or he's getting garbage time carries more than usual. Right. So these 2 guys where, they're 99th percentile ceiling, probably Madison and Cook can't hit that in the same game, but they're 75th, that might actually be positively correlated.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think we hear people say all the time that, your lineup should tell a story. Is that like a overly simplistic way to look at it? Or does it maybe like not encourage enough creativity into what an actual story looks like? Because we've seen like really weird, to me, what looks like really weird, what I'd consider probably bad lineups, are some of the ones that have gone on to win. Like you mentioned, like 2 Chiefs tied it. Like, okay, the one we were talking about, Houston and Kansas City, it was 5 Chiefs. It was 1 Texan. The Texan was Deshaun Watson. Okay. So Deshaun Watson has to have a great game, and none of his pass catchers are a part of the optimal lineup. 5 Chiefs. 2 of them are tight ends. One of them's Patrick Mahomes, and then the other is a kicker. So the kicker's in the optimal lineup, but no other Texans pass catcher. So, like, to me, like, if you submitted that lineup to me before the contest, I'd say this is a bad lineup. You should not play this lineup. But what makes it good? Like, why does that work? Is it just because I have limited imagination?
No,
Clearly.
I mean, if I'm making a single entry, there's not a chance in hell that I'm making that lineup. So there is some, when I say let the machine do its thing, sometimes you need to accept lineups that you wouldn't make. And one reason why is like just being unique is so important that I sometimes think a unique bad lineup is better than a heavily duped good lineup. This was extra tilting, this slate. I remember it very well because I had a lot of Blake Bell, way more than the field. I was doing super well. And then Butker got a field goal at the end and I won. But a dude ran a 150-man train with this lineup.
Yeah.
So I barely won any money because he got chopped so many ways with his 150-man. But
all right, now walk me through that. Like, is that a positive EV or a highly negative EV thing to do, to run a 150-man train in a in a GPP?
My intuition says it's negative EV because each subsequent, the expected value of winning first place I guess if you win it and you ship, you're getting all 150 prizes, but the idea in these showdown slates is first place is usually, disparately huge percentage of the income or of the prize pool that you want to give yourselves as many chances as possible to just get one lineup to hit that first place one. I suppose maybe you could make an argument there's some EV in that if people are doing things like I am and you get kind of a bunch of crazy lineups trying to hit the nuts and you have a pretty standard lineup that's just really good, that maybe you're going to min cash that lineup at a really high rate and then 150. But I would never do that. I don't know. I don't think it could possibly be EV.
Yeah, I'm walking through it in my head and thinking, well, maybe it makes sense if you're playing a really popular lineup and you know that if this one hits, you're gonna chop, and so you want to improve the amount of that chop in your favor. But even still, that's I'm almost positive that's negative EV. Speaking of negative,
and
EV,
if you knew it was gonna chop a bunch of ways, you would just not play that lineup.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm going to throw up a lineup on our screen. We talked about this one a little bit too, and that's this, and hopefully you can see it here. It's the Ravens Browns. This is like a 1:00 slate. Now, the one good thing about Showdown is there's tons of slates to play now. It used to just be the primetime slates, and still those are the only ones you're going to get massive prize pools on. But this you're getting better prize pools on Showdown slates than on a lot of niche sports. So you can still justify putting some time in here. But this was a Browns versus Ravens game. It's at Cleveland. And a guy played a 5-1 stack with the only one, of course, the 5 side was the Baltimore side. The only Brown was Jarvis Landry. So we're getting Landry without a pass catcher. And on top of that, we're getting 5 Ravens. Lamar in the captain spot. Makes sense. Like putting Lamar in the captain spot, and you probably made money all year last year. However, pairing Lamar with 3 of his own running backs, not many of which have strong passing game profiles. Obviously, Mark Ingram sort of over-delivered in the receiving touchdown column last year, but we're talking about 3 running backs paired with a quarterback captain and his tight end in it. So, like the amount of things you're asking Lamar to be able to pull off there to win this lineup is just insane to me. And I look at this, and this is another one. I'm like, this is a bad lineup, but in Showdown with so much emphasis on uniqueness. Oh, and by the way, spent all the salary as well. $0 remaining, ended up being a 2-person split at top. So, at least 2 people had this crazy notion of playing 3 running backs with Lamar. How do you look at this and determine, like, objectively, good or bad lineup?
Yeah, I mean, probably bad with the 3 running backs. That seems to be pushing it. But again, this is where I think we have to reshape our brains to not think about everyone hitting their ceiling, because that's not what we need to happen. So what happens in a game like this is, I'm assuming just Baltimore rolls Cleveland, in a game like this, and you're getting Justice Hill work at the end of the game in a blowout. Jarvis Landry's probably getting a bunch of short catches, just playing from behind in this game. And I think where we might, and Lamar slates are always a little bit weird because he can run for so many of his points that you don't necessarily need the same pass catcher equity coming back on it. But I'm trying to phrase this the right way, but so sometimes game outcomes just work out in a strange way where the distribution of points is such that, Lamar, he scored 50 points in this game. So this is
in the caps.
These are the actual points. So
yeah,
this is definitely a weird one where,
well, so here's Lamar what happened. Lamar goes off, has a great game. So does Mark Andrews. Mark Andrews and Lamar were clearly going to be in the optimal lineup somewhere. And you just needed to be able to get those two guys in with a great game from Lamar. You had to put in some cheap options. And you see Gus Edwards was $1,000 and Justice Hill was $800. So you're not asking for very much from them, but you're essentially asking all the volume from Lamar to go to Mark Andrews. I mean, there may have been, Hollywood Brown could have caught a touchdown in this game and not been a part of the optimal, just the way the salary all comes together. So yeah, you're right. It's really interesting.
Yeah. I don't think I would have played that lineup, but that's another example of those 5-1 onslaughts. Those are underplayed, and those teams get weird because when you're doing a 5-1 onslaught, you generally have a couple players from the same team that you wouldn't think go together. And that's the thing. We're talking about like guys being positively correlated. We want to put correlation in our lineup, but sometimes there are outcomes where two players are negatively correlated, but that whole combination of 6 guys, still is a plus EV lineup. And I want to be careful the way I word that because you don't want to, you generally want to try to avoid negative correlation, but I think we view it as too binary sometimes where it's like
exactly
RB1, RB2 are negatively correlated. Can't put them in the same lineup. Well,
that just means they tend to score in opposite directions of one another. It doesn't mean it's a hard and fast rule.
Exactly. And we don't know how many total fantasy points are going to be scored in that game. If they just happen to run a lot, or this game, it's a blowout. So the running backs all get a lot of work because the team probably just ran the whole entire second half or the whole entire fourth quarter. And, Justice Hill gets in this game running out clock. Weird things happen. And it's super challenging though to say, okay, weird things happen, but I also want to make smart lineups. And I really like Showdown and I love talking about it, but I do see where sometimes when I talk about it, I could see someone at home listening being like, wait, am I supposed to make a smart lineup or just like a crazy lineup? And, trust me, we feel the same difficulty making our own lineups.
Yeah, exactly. And it's tough to even, nominate a player as a great option for the week because it sort of depends on what you have to do around that player to fill out the rest of the lineup. So, combinations of players is probably the better way to think of it than specific players because, that's how we're building. It doesn't matter what any one single player does. It matters how the 6 fit together. So, yeah, that's a great point. Now, go ahead.
I was just going to say, going back to the telling a story with the lineup, you want your story to be based, I think, on a certain game outcome, not based on every player hitting their ceiling. I think that's the better way to think about it. If you think about a certain game outcome, maybe you get to that Baltimore lineup. I don't know. Maybe not. But if you're thinking about solely from Lamar's captain, I have to play 3 pass catchers. I think that's where we're flawed is when we think about it too, like micro player ceiling stories. You want to think more like games. Okay, this game's a slodge fest. The quarterbacks might not be in the lineup at all because there's a bunch of guys racking up PPR points and no one scoring touchdowns, different things like that. And all of a sudden you can see how some of these lineups that seem bad, will they actually match a certain game outcome well?
Yeah, I think a really helpful exercise is to sort of self-optimize some old box scores. Like go back to a game earlier in the season, take the Baltimore side, go back to a game earlier in the season, take the Cleveland side and just look at those two and assume they were playing each other that game and what would have happened. And you'll kind of quickly realize, I mean, even though that's not a perfectly correlated example, you'll realize how combinations work a little bit better. I think that's just sort of a really helpful way to look at it.
That's a really good idea. Yeah.
Now, are you exclusively playing MME contests, or are you doing cash games on Showdown? How, what's your general contest selection like? Are you playing the 1 o'clock slates and stuff too?
I don't do cash games. I don't really play much cash in anything anymore. Just as DFS and the edges have slimmed down a little bit more, I think it's more important to kind of tune in on what you do well and make sure you do it really well. So I don't do cash games. I will sometimes, if I have a lineup that pops that I really like, maybe I'll throw it into 3 max. I think there was like a 183 max that was there quite often. But for the most part, I'm just MME and Showdown. I, for the most part, played just the big slate. So the primetime slates, Thursday night, Sunday night, Monday night. I might change that this year and try and play more slates. We'll see how it goes. We'll see what the prize pools look like. I think what's hard with my approach is it's almost geared towards that steep payout structure with a lot going to first place, where I know, I'm going to have some bad variance where I'm just going to not return very much when I don't bank. And it's easier to swallow that when first place is a really high amount. Whereas if you're playing like the slate you showed where first place is 5K, my risk is the same as it is when first place is 100K. And I don't know, my chances of winning probably don't increase as much as you would think with the smaller field, just based on the way I'm making lineups. My methodology is really kind of geared towards those large field tournaments.
Yeah, for sure. And I guess just one piece of feedback is the max entry on some of those smaller contests is going to be a little bit smaller than 150. Like that was a 70 entry tournament, but still you make a good point that it takes a top heavy prize pool to justify it. Otherwise you have to kind of maybe switch your line of thinking. Like maybe when there's only 2,353 entrants in a tournament, what it takes to win is maybe not so unique anymore. Or at least the uniqueness doesn't become as important.
Right. And there's situations where, I don't know, some third string backup tight end, let's say, just based on range of outcomes, guys get hurt, catches a fluky touchdown. This guy's in the optimal lineup, I don't know, 3% of the time, let's just say. Now, on a really large field tournament where you have to hit the absolute nuts to win the tournament, I kind of want to play that guy 3% of the time or whatever, because no one's going to play him. And I know he's going to be in the optimal 3% of the time. And I don't care what happens to him the 97% of the time he's not in the optimal, which for a guy like that, he's probably scoring 0 points the vast majority of that time. Now, when I'm in a smaller field tournament and I don't need the absolute nuts and I'm thinking about the EV of a play, a guy like him might be in the optimal lineup 3% of the time, but it might not be worth playing because I know, that I know those the 97% of the time he's not in the optimal lineup, he's going to do absolutely horrible and drag down the EV in my lineup. So your methodology, switches a little bit from, okay, what spread do I need to hit the absolute nuts to, okay, what's the expected value of this player? Just because he's in the optimal lineup more often than the field's going to play him doesn't necessarily make him a plus EV play. I hope I explained that right, because it's a little weird, but that's one of the things I started thinking about at the end of last season.
Yeah, and on top of that, you're gaining massive leverage on the field, because they're not playing that third string tight end at the 3% optimal rate that you've determined. They're going to be playing at 0.1% or something like that. I mean, it's just going to be an afterthought. That's the benefit of playing 150 lineups. You're not able to cover all your bases, despite what some people would have you believe. Even in Showdown, you can't cover them all with 150, not even close. So, but that does help you be a bit more contrarian and give you a little bit more safety net. Now, one thing I do like to ask is the ups and downs of being a tournament player, especially when you are seeking out the unlikely. I mean, that's literally what you're trying to do by building unique lineups is to make money when nobody else does. And so that means that typically you don't win. Like typically it's not going to go well for you, but when it does, obviously you're rewarded disproportionately. So just like mentally, what is that like for you as a player?
It's a little easier for me to swallow in Showdown in a weird way, because almost any methodology you use in Showdown, you have that same variance, because it's almost first or bust, especially with the amount of dupes there can be sometimes, and just the weird things that happen in a game, that it frees me up a little bit to play the way that I do in Showdown, because
There's no
I
such
can
thing as a
take
bad
some
lineup.
chance. Yeah, I can take some chances because, I know my median outcome is I'm losing half my entry fee no matter what I do. That's like my medium outcome almost no matter what. Now, if I was playing a regular full MME slate, I'm thinking about things a little bit differently, because my median outcome is changing a little bit based on how contrarian I am, or just how much I'm playing the good plays. It's a completely different game. And there, it's a little bit harder to maybe swallow the variance there. Whereas in Showdown, I don't know, I'm just able to swallow it, because going into it, I just know my median outcome is so low to begin with,
Right.
that I guess it doesn't impact me as much. It's still hard when you go through, but you're going to go through, 3 weeks, 4 weeks of basically punting away half your entry fee, 3 times a weekend. It's not easy. And of course, everyone's going to have different bankroll. Everyone's going to have different amount of entries they can enter. That's the way that I do it. But luckily, I think I found something that's high enough expected value that I'm okay sort of taking on that variance. If I started to doubt that a little bit more, it'd become harder. But that's the nice thing about letting the machine do its thing, and like understanding on positive expected value.
Get somebody to blame then.
You can blame the
machine. Not your
machine,
fault.
and you can isolate the emotions out of it a little bit. Just being like, all right, I'm going to enter these teams. I know it's easy.
Now.
Yeah.
Oh, that makes sense. What are your thoughts? I know you're not a cash player, but do you think cash is viable on Showdown? Because, obviously it's super volatile. Like, we all know who the good players are on a slate. Like, you can just jam as many of them in as you want to, but then the ball snapped and all hell breaks loose. And like, is that too much volatility to like beat the rake long term in cash games? Or as long as you're dedicated to like grinding the lobby, is that a potentially profitable venture?
I think it's still profitable, especially with the way the captain works. I'm guessing in cash games, a lot of people aren't using the captain optimally, and roster construction can get weird, on some of these slates with really expensive studs. You might have to play, even in cash, $600 fourth or fifth receiver who you project to get 3 targets in the game.
Right. Yeah.
Just because the optimal points from the really expensive quarterback that you have to play in captain works out. So I could see where it makes sense. And I think sometimes we're like, oh, that game's too volatile for cash. Well, your expected value going into a cash game, regardless of the variance, is the same, whether there's more variance or not. It might feel worse, and it might maybe take more iterations of cash games for things to even out if you're plus expected value. But I don't know if in a vacuum that means it's a worse cash game to play. I could be wrong there, but just trying to think that through. But I don't really play cash, so I'm not.
Well, and speaking of iterations, like obviously as a GPP player, NFL season can be pretty hit or miss because there's only so many slates. Do you think there are enough Showdown slates over the course of the year? Like, I think there was about 140 total, DraftKings slates last year for Showdown. Not all of them big prize pools, but do you think there's enough slates out there for a tournament player to realize an actual expected value over the course of a season?
I don't know if you ever quite get to the actual expected value with how crazy the payout structures can be, but if you think about it, 140, that's almost 10 times the amount of main slates there are. So if you're comparing it to main slate, Showdown, maybe there's a little bit added variance on an individual Showdown slate. Maybe there's a little bit added variance with the payout structure being more top heavy in a Showdown slate. But if you're going to give me 10 times the amount of Showdown slates as main slates, my EV is probably more likely to net out closer to what it actually is in Showdown than it is in main slate.
Yeah, for sure. Well, good, man. This has been an excellent conversation, and I've enjoyed talking the Showdown stuff with you. You have any other final thoughts before we get out of here?
No, I think we covered it. Hopefully, I wasn't too dense with some of how I was.
I love it, man. I hope everybody else does, because I'm just sitting here eating this stuff up. I think it's great. Like I love the game theory aspect of it. And I mean, I guess maybe that's sort of a final question we can kind of end on is, I think it's really, really important to know the game, to know the sport on a main slate. And it seems less important to know the sport and more important to know, game theory aspects and the soft skills and that sort of thing on a showdown slate. Would you agree with that? Or is that maybe a bit too simplistic?
No, I would agree with that. And I think my methodology is sort of evidence of that, where, with the exception of setting some initial volume projections, I'm not taking a very active hand. I'd probably take a more active hand in a main slate. And also because, as we've discussed, the importance of being unique is so important that, I definitely think the game theory matters a bit more when there's a few lineup iterations out there that are just going to be so heavily owned that they're negative expected value, even if they're good lineups. And that's going to push the, EV more towards the game theory players than it is the people that are just good at identifying, a good lineup in a vacuum.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Mike, I really do appreciate your time. Why don't you tell everybody what you're working on, where they can find you, and how to keep up with you?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at 2hats1mike, and also, as I noted at the top of the show, director of analytics at Establish the Run. We just launched our NBA restart package. We'll have that going on throughout the playoffs, and we've got, season-long rankings for every format you can imagine over on Establish the Run for NFL, getting geared up for DFS this season too. So a lot of stuff going on. I'm really excited by it, and looking forward to this season. Knock on wood, we're able to play a full season.
I mean, I've been getting my feet wet on some DraftKings best balls. I wanted to be like our first mover in that tournament and maybe get some accidental edges that way based on some news that'll break over the course of camp. But man, again, thank you for joining us. We'll catch up with you here soon.
Thank you, Justin.
Wow, we're batting 1,000, guys. 2 for 2 on incredible guests to open up this show. Many thanks yesterday to Brian Jester. Once again, thanks to Mike Leone from ETR for joining us today. This is premium knowledge that these guys are spitting for you for free. No paywall here. So make sure you show your thanks by subscribing to this channel, both on your podcast platform and on YouTube, both those places, and give us the thumbs up, give us the 5 stars, leave a rating or review. I would really, really, really appreciate that. That helps keep this content available to as many people as possible. So once you do that, go over and check out CaptainSpot.com. That's CPTspot.com, and you'll find out everything that we're doing here on the site. So we have some great promo offers. We've got some good sign-on bonuses with a handful of sites. Go check that out. And obviously I've got the ebook that I'm working on. So we'll have more information coming out on that later. So once again, thank you to Mike for joining us. We'll see you guys soon.